essentially, when we talk about engineering a complex system, right, there's this underlying expectation of absolute precision. You have to have a deep respect for physical reality.
Right, because if you don't, things literally fall apart.
Exactly. I mean, imagine you're building a suspension bridge. You have to calculate the load-bearing capacity of the steel. You have to account for wind shear, thermal expansion, the tensile strength of the cables.
Yeah, you build a blueprint around the raw materials, you have to acknowledge their specific limits and their strengths.
Because the feedback loop there is binary and it is immediate. The bridge either holds the weight of the traffic or it completely collapses into the river below.
You don't really get to argue with gravity.
No, you don't. You can't just tell the steel that it should behave differently based on, like, your ideological preferences.
That would be catastrophic.
But then you step into the world of social engineering and things get weird. You look at modern sociology, corporate structures, family law, and suddenly that rigorous, reality-based blueprint is just, it's completely thrown out the window. It's totally discarded.
Yeah. And we're currently looking at a societal landscape that is operating essentially like a developer trying to run this cutting-edge, highly complex, entirely theoretical software program on a legacy biological motherboard that was forged hundreds of thousands of years ago.
Right, and the conflict comes up when the system inevitably starts to crash.
Which it is doing.
Yeah. But instead of looking at the incompatibility between the newly coded social software and the ancient human hardware, the architects of the system blame the hardware. They get angry at the motherboard for not processing code it was never actually designed to read.
That structural crash, right? That exact friction between human biology and modern societal expectations is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
It's going to be an intense one.
It really is. We are jumping into a massive, comprehensive review of a highly provocative, ultra-long, and incredibly incisive new ebook. It's called Victim Bombing Harpies, Spiritual Bypassing to Avoid Responsibility and Blame Others.
Quite the title.
Yeah, written by Conrad Riker, published in 2025. And this text really serves as a forensic audit of modern institutions. I mean, it's a book that fundamentally refuses to pull a single punch regarding gender dynamics, biology, or structural power.
Definitely. And for you listening right now, especially if you're part of the men's rights activist audience or if you identify as a red-pilled man navigating the manosphere, this book is being explicitly positioned as an absolute must-read.
Oh, absolutely.
Riker's stated mission here is to help you understand the history and the fundamental architecture of our institutions, from the corporate boardroom all the way down to the family courts.
Right, before he claims they were captured and fundamentally reprogrammed by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Exactly. So if you want to follow along with us today, or if you want to read his full, completely uncensored arguments for yourself to see the raw data he's pulling from, I strongly encourage you to buy the book.
You really need to see the source material.
You do. You can check Amazon, Kindle, and Google Play Books right now to grab a copy. I also highly recommend you follow the author at Conrad and Riker on Substack for more of his ongoing content and cultural analysis.
He posts a lot of in-depth stuff there.
He does. And hey, before we jump in, a quick reminder to hit that like button and subscribe to the show. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing you these really intense, comprehensive deep dives into the most provocative ideas out there.
Who couldn't do it without you?
We really couldn't. Now, before we start examining the load-bearing walls of Riker's argument, we have to establish a very strict ground rule for how we're going to navigate this material today.
We do, because, the architecture of this book relies on highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
Riker is addressing intense right-wing and manosphere talking points, and he uses language that is basically designed to shatter modern political correctness. So we have to set an absolute standard of impartiality here.
Yes. We are explicitly stating to you, the listener, right up front, that we are not endorsing the viewpoints of this content. We are not taking sides on this cultural battlefield. Not at all. Our role today is strictly to act as impartial guides. We are here to synthesize, interrogate, and convey the fascinating, polarizing, and deeply controversial ideas contained in Riker's original source material.
We're treating this text as a cultural artifact.
Exactly. We're going to examine the underlying mechanisms of his arguments, look at the data he cites, and try to understand exactly how he constructs his worldview.
And to do that, we've structured our journey today to mirror the trajectory of Riker's overarching thesis.
Which starts at the foundation.
Right. We're going to start at the bedrock.
Yeah.
His arguments rooted entirely in evolutionary biology and this concept of human hardware. We really need to understand the biological baseline he operates from.
And then from there, we'll trace how he applies that biological lens to critique corporate culture and what he calls educational victimhood.
Then we'll explore his pretty brutal breakdown of modern dating dynamics and the family court system.
Yeah, scam, as he calls it.
We'll get to that, yeah. And finally, we will examine his proposed solutions, what he categorizes as the masculinity counterattack.
Okay, let's start digging into that bedrock. Because Riker doesn't open his book by complaining about modern politics or, like, recent legislation. He goes straight back to ancient history.
Way back. To the Pleistocene epoch, actually.
Yeah. His core thesis is that modern society is currently in a state of rapid, observable decay, specifically because we're actively ignoring the reality of evolutionary biology.
He argues very forcefully that men and women are just not blank slates. You can't just program them by social conditioning.
Right. And he leans heavily on the evolutionary psychology research of figures like Dr. David Buss.
Buss's work is foundational here. It basically argues that over hundreds of thousands of years, men and women faced entirely different evolutionary pressures.
Survival pressures.
Exactly. And these differing pressures forged fundamentally different psychological and physical traits simply to ensure survival and reproduction.
And Riker also pulls from anthropological data, right? He specifically references Harvard researchers like Richard Wrangham to look at the historical realities of male coalitionary violence and resource competition.
Right. The real brutal history of how early humans lived.
And when Riker talks about these differing evolutionary pressures, he gets incredibly specific about the physical mechanisms. Like, he points out that male skeletons actually evolved thicker bones, particularly in the skull and the forearms.
Yeah, he connects that physiological reality directly to intermale combat.
Exactly. He argues that men evolved for risk-taking, for coalition building, but strictly in the context of warfare and hunting, and for the relentless, hazardous provisioning of resources.
Meanwhile, he posits that women evolved to focus on nurturing, child-rearing, and crucially, this is a big point for him, prioritizing social harmony and group cohesion over strict objective accountability.
Let's unpack that social harmony mechanism, because it's vital to his whole thesis.
It really is. So think about an ancient hunter-gatherer tribe. A woman's survival and the survival of her offspring depended almost entirely on her integration into the social fabric of the group.
Because being ostracized literally meant death.
Exactly. So the psychological drive to avoid direct conflict, to shift blame, to maintain status, and to seek emotional comfort, those became heavily selected evolutionary traits.
Whereas men, on the other hand, establish hierarchy through overt physical dominance.
Right, and competence in really dangerous tasks.
And Riker's argument is that these deeply ingrained, chemically driven imperatives did not simply vanish just because we invented air conditioning and Wi-Fi.
They're still running in the background, or, well, in the foreground, really.
Yeah, which brings us to where Riker connects that ancient hardware to the modern software crash. He claims that modern feminism hasn't actually liberated women from their biology at all.
No, instead he argues it has handed them a systemic get-out-of-jail-free card.
Right. His assertion is that society now actively permits and even encourages women to use their biological impulses. Specifically, that impulse to shift blame to maintain social standing and seek comfort as an offensive weapon.
And it does this while simultaneously demonizing the very male traits that built civilization in the first place.
He's referring to the biochemical reality of testosterone, male aggression, competitive drive, and spatial intelligence.
Right. Riker points out that these are the traits that constructed the physical world around us. They built the skyscrapers, the suspension bridges, the power grids, the aqueducts.
All of which require an obsession with objective reality.
And a willingness to face extreme physical danger.
Right.
A drive to conquer the environment.
And to illustrate the raw physical reality of this dynamic today, Riker brings up some pretty staggering modern data points. He leans on Bureau of Labor Statistics data to note that men currently account for 93% of all workplace fatalities.
93%. That's a massive number.
Yeah.
We are talking about the basic mechanics of keeping a modern civilization functioning.
Right, like logging, deep-sea commercial fishing, high-voltage electrical line repair in freezing rain, oil rig drilling, heavy construction.
The fatality rates in these sectors are just astronomically skewed male.
And Riker's argument is that society is completely dependent on this disposable male labor. We rely on men risking their lives, crushing their bodies, and facing lethal hazards daily just so the rest of us can turn on the lights and have packages delivered to our doors.
Yet society turns around and casually labels the exact energy required to do those jobs as toxic masculinity.
He writes that it's the ultimate double bind. We demand the fruits of male risk-taking, but we penalize the behavioral traits that actually generate it.
The paradox he highlights there is profound. He notes that in a single recent year, there were over 5,400 workplace deaths in the United States, with the vast, overwhelming majority being men doing dangerous, unglamorous work.
Right.
And Riker observes that society is perfectly happy to praise male sacrifice when it's strictly utilitarian, like firefighters running into a collapsing, burning building to save strangers.
Sure, we call them heroes.
Exactly. But the moment a man uses those exact same testosterone-driven assertive traits to advocate for himself in a corporate boardroom or political debate, those traits are instantly pathologized as abusive or domineering.
Okay, wait. I need to push back on Riker's logic here for a second, because there seems to be a gap in the timeline.
Oh, go for it.
If these traits like male dominance, risk-taking, female nurturing, blame-shifting, if they're hardwired by millions of years of brutal evolutionary selection, how does Riker explain society's sudden ability to suppress these male traits so effectively in modern institutions?
That's a great question.
I mean, if it's biological hardware and biology is as ruthless as he claims, how did the sociological software manage to take over the mainframe in just a few decades?
So that tension is actually the pivot point of his entire thesis.
Sure.
Riker's answer is that these traits are not actually being suppressed successfully at all.
They're not.
No. He firmly believes biology always wins out eventually. Instead of suppressing these traits, he says our institutions have simply pathologized them, creating this massive, unsustainable pressure cooker.
Okay.
They constructed artificial environments like HR departments, grievance studies programs, and family courts that artificially punish natural male behavior and artificially reward what he views as natural female manipulation tactics.
So the biological drives are all still functioning perfectly.
Exactly. But the societal reward system has been completely inverted by ideological fiat.
Wow. Okay, and that inversion leads us directly into his critique of the modern workplace, a phenomenon he labels the corporate coddling complex.
Oh, he goes hard on this.
He takes an absolute sledgehammer to modern corporate America, pointing his critique specifically at human resources departments and diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives.
He paints a landscape of a corporate world where the traditional, historically male-dominated metrics of success, absolute competence, ruthless efficiency, objective bottom-line results, have been systematically replaced
Replaced by what?
by a new, highly subjective currency, emotional intelligence and performative vulnerability. And Riker argues that these concepts are not benign management strategies. He says they've been weaponized to redistribute power away from the competent.
He refers to it as an emotional Ponzi scheme, right?
Yes.
He asserts that in the modern office environment, actual competence is actively punished if it happens to make anyone feel uncomfortable or insecure.
While performative fragility, like the ability to loudly broadcast your distress or your marginalized status, is heavily rewarded with promotions, accommodations, and structural power.
He actually coins the term affirmative incompetence to describe this dynamic.
Which is a brutal phrase. And to ground this in empirical reality, he looks at macroeconomic data. For instance, he dissects the case study of Norway.
Right, the board quotas.
Yeah, in the mid-2000s, Norway became the first country to mandate forced gender quotas on the boards of public limited companies, requiring at least 40% female representation.
And what did the data show?
Well, Riker points to research from economists, including a widely cited study by University of Michigan researchers who tracked the financial results of this massive social engineering policy.
Right.
They found that forcing these quotas caused a significant drop in corporate value, with some metrics showing a 12 to 18% nosedive in corporate profits and an increase in corporate leverage.
A 12 to 18% drop, and the mechanism behind that drop is key to Riker's point. According to him, forcing a gender quota completely ignores the biological reality that women, on average, voluntarily choose different life paths.
Right.
He argues they often select lower stress, more flexible jobs to prioritize family or work-life balance, meaning the pool of women hyper-obsessed with climbing to the absolute apex of the corporate ladder is simply smaller than the pool of men.
And so when you force parity, you inevitably dip lower into the competence pool just to meet the ideological quota.
Right, and he aggressively contrasts that Norwegian profit drop with the engineering culture at SpaceX.
SpaceX serves as his ultimate counterexample. He notes that SpaceX utilizes engineering teams that are overwhelmingly male, upwards of 80% in the core engineering sectors.
And what's the result of that heavily male, highly competitive, technically ruthless environment?
They achieve massive, civilization-altering innovation. They land reusable rockets on drone ships in the middle of the ocean.
Exactly. Riker points out they file exponentially more patents and achieve technical milestones that heavily bureaucratized, diversity-focused organizations like NASA really struggle to match in the modern era. But let's look at the underlying logic here for a second. If SpaceX is 80% male and highly innovative, is Riker claiming that diversity inherently causes failure? Or is he making the narrower claim that forced quotas in highly technical fields simply bypass merit, regardless of the demographic?
Because those are two very different arguments.
Ex-
He's making the latter, but definitely with a sharp biological edge. Riker argues that when you prioritize demographic parity over absolute objective competence, you fundamentally compromise the structural integrity of the organization.
He views the modern HR department not as a regulatory body, but as an autoimmune disease.
Yeah, that's a powerful metaphor. He says the system was originally designed to protect the corporate body from massive legal threats, like genuine harassment lawsuits, but it has become hypersensitized.
So it starts attacking healthy tissue.
Exactly. It attacks healthy, competent, tissue-like standard, blunt employee feedback or aggressive project timelines because it misidentifies those standard male behaviors as trauma or toxicity.
And he illustrates this autoimmune response with some incredibly vivid, almost absurd anecdotes to highlight this culture of fragility.
Oh, the Starbucks barista case.
Yes. He discusses a specific legal case involving a Starbucks barista who sued the company over what she claimed was microaggression-induced PTSD.
The mechanics of that case were staggering.
Truly. She was essentially corrected by a manager on her latte art and store procedures. And she claimed this standard managerial correction caused her severe, debilitating psychological trauma.
And a jury ultimately awarded her $2.3 million in damages.
$2.3 million. And Riker violently contrasts this massive payout for subjective hurt feelings with the physical reality of the 93% of workplace fatalities.
Right, the men getting crushed by heavy machinery or electrocuted on the job are just told that danger is part of the paycheck.
Exactly. And that contrast perfectly encapsulates his concept of the trauma Olympics. Trauma narratives, he argues, no longer function as medical diagnoses, they function as social currency.
Right, if you can successfully claim to be a victim within a corporate structure, you gain immediate, unassailable power over your peers and your managers. No one to question your lived experience without facing termination.
But Riker points out there is a massive hidden trap here for men, which he labels the empathy double bind.
The empathy double bind is fascinating because it exposes the hypocrisy of corporate culture. Corporate wellness seminars are constantly telling men, you need to be vulnerable, you need to open up, you need to dismantle your stoicism and share your feelings with your team.
But Riker points to a specific Harvard Business Review study that tracked the careers of thousands of men. The empirical data showed that men who actually followed this advice and displayed vulnerability or admitted to struggling in the workplace were significantly penalized.
Yeah, they were 34% less likely to advance in their careers or be selected for leadership roles.
34%. The mechanism of perception is entirely different from men and women. While female colleagues leveraging tears or emotional distress often secure accommodations, reduced workloads, or sympathetic mentorship, the men were judged by an entirely different ancient standard.
Riker's analysis is that women are socially permitted to weaponize vulnerability to trigger a protective response. But when men display vulnerability, the ancient biological hardware of everyone in the room kicks in.
And those men are instantly categorized as weak, unreliable, or lacking the necessary leadership frame to protect the tribe.
He actually quotes the clinical psychologist Jordan Peterson here, noting that displaying vulnerability in a competitive dominance hierarchy does not invite empathy. It simply invites predation.
And he extrapolates this dynamic into a macro theory he calls the equality delusion index. Riker posits a direct inverse correlation. The higher a company's internal gender parity and DEI score, the faster its core innovation and market dominance die.
Why? Because in his view, the company has officially replaced a meritocracy, which naturally skews male and highly competitive, high-risk, hyper-obsessive fields with a grievance economy.
The company's primary product is no longer software or manufacturing. Its primary product is managing internal complaints.
But if we follow Riker's logic down this path, it raises a really profound psychological question. If the corporate world is heavily dominated by this kind of emotional manipulation, performative fragility, and grievance mongering, how do the individuals actively participating in it justify their behavior to themselves?
How do they sleep at night?
Right. How do they avoid the crushing cognitive dissonance of knowing they are succeeding through manipulation rather than merit?
And that psychological question takes us directly into one of the most conceptually interesting sections of the book. Riker introduces this idea of spiritual scam artists and the phenomenon of weaponized therapy speak.
Right.
He unpacks the massive modern wellness, therapy, and New Age spirituality industries, fundamentally viewing them as a psychological laundering service.
And to explain the mechanics of this, he borrows a term originally coined in the 1980s by the Buddhist teacher and psychotherapist John Welwood, spiritual bypassing.
Spiritual bypassing.
Yeah. Welwood originally used this term to describe a specific psychological defense mechanism where people use spiritual ideas and practices to sidestep, avoid, or bypass facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks.
Like using meditation to hide from your trauma.
Exactly. It was a critique of that. But Riker takes Welwood's concept and applies it specifically to modern women and fourth-wave feminism.
Riker argues that women are actively using the aesthetics of spirituality astrology, New Age manifestation mantras, crystal healing, and highly clinical therapy jargon to completely dodge real-world accountability for their actions.
He views the entire $4.5 trillion global wellness industry not as a healthcare sector, but as a massive hyper-capitalist machine.
A machine designed to monetize victimhood, validate terrible choices, and sell that validation back to people at a premium.
It's a devastating critique of faux enlightenment. Riker contrasts this modern wellness culture with genuine historical spiritual traditions. Whether you look at Zen Buddhism, early Christian asceticism, or Stoicism, those ancient traditions demanded brutal, often intensely painful self-honesty.
They required extreme personal accountability and the stripping away of the ego.
But instead of that rigorous self-examination, Riker says modern influencers sell forgiveness amethysts.
Forgiveness amethyst, yeah.
They teach their millions of followers to blame patriarchal energy blocks or toxic external frequencies for their own terrible financial decisions, their credit card debt, or their failed relationships.
The locus of control is entirely externalized.
Exactly.
And the examples he gives to illustrate this externalization are almost comedic, except he views them as symptoms of a deep societal rot. Like he talks about women literally blaming the astrological phenomena of Mercury being in retrograde for their own missed deadlines and incompetence at work. But then he pivots to a much darker, much more destructive manifestation of this therapy culture. He discusses the highly controversial and largely debunked pseudoscience of recovered memory therapy.
And this is where the psychological laundering becomes legally weaponized. Riker notes the terrifying convenience of how these vague, previously entirely forgotten memories of childhood trauma or historical abuse magically seem to unearth themselves right in the middle of a lucrative divorce settlement or a custody battle.
Yeah, that timing is always interesting.
To back this up, he cites the pioneering research of cognitive psychologist Dr. Elizabeth Loftus. Loftus has spent decades demonstrating the malleability of human memory, showing exactly how easily false memories can be entirely implanted into a patient's mind by leading questions from suggestive, ideologically motivated therapists.
And Riker extends this critique of suggestive therapy to the broader cultural landscape. He cites data suggesting that a massive percentage of modern therapists now actively push their clients to reinterpret standard childhood difficulties or normal relationship friction as severe trauma.
Riker argues this process isn't healing, it's ideological extortion. It's building a permanent excuse architecture for the client, ensuring they never have to take responsibility for their own emotional regulation.
But there is a specific data point Riker uses in this section that really requires deeper scrutiny.
Okay.
He points out the massive cultural phenomenon of true crime media, noting that roughly 73% of dedicated true crime podcast listeners are women.
Yes.
Riker argues that this obsession is an evolutionary threat simulation. He posits that women's brains are hardwired to study predators and understand the mechanics of danger.
Okay, this is exactly where I need to stop and interrogate his logic.
Do it.
I understand the evolutionary theory that women, being physically smaller and historically more vulnerable to male violence, might have an adaptive interest in studying how predators operate.
Sure, that makes biological sense.
But Riker takes this statistic and makes a massive leap. How does he connect this passive consumption of a podcast about a serial killer to the way women actively interact with everyday men in their marriages or workplaces? Right.
It feels like a massive leap to say listening to a story translates directly to weaponized behavior in a relationship.
It is a massive leap, but it is a critical connection for the architecture of his worldview. Riker argues that this constant voyeuristic consumption of extreme victim narratives fundamentally alters the consumer's neurological baseline and their worldview.
How so?
He says it trains people to view all male-female interactions through a rigid predator-prey dynamic. If you are constantly simulating lethal threats in your mind, your amygdala becomes hypersensitized.
So you're jumping at shadows.
Exactly. You begin to see the shadow of a predator everywhere, in a sideways glance from a coworker, in a mundane disagreement over household finances, in an unreturned text message.
And Riker argues that this heightened artificial state of anxiety, constantly fed by the media ecosystem, sets the stage for the ultimate battleground.
Yes, it primes women to view their partners not as teammates, but as potential threats to be managed, which leads us directly into his analysis of the mating market and family courts. The mating market. This brings us into the core of Riker's incredibly bleak, highly mechanistic view of romance, marriage, and institutional collapse.
Very bleak.
To establish the baseline here, he argues that female hypergamy, the biological and sociological drive for women to date across and up the socioeconomic and dominance hierarchy, is completely hardwired and inescapable.
And to explain the mechanics of hypergamy, he relies again on Dr. David Buss's landmark 37 culture study.
That study is huge in this field.
Yeah. Buss and his team surveyed over 10,000 individuals across 37 diverse cultures, spanning 6 continents and 5 islands. The methodology was specifically designed to find universal human traits that transcended local culture.
And the findings were definitive. Universally, across all cultures, regardless of the local political system or economy, women consistently prioritized resources, ambition, and social status and long-term mate far more than men did.
While men, conversely, prioritize youth and physical attractiveness as markers of fertility.
Right. And Riker argues that modern dating apps haven't liberated us from these ancient biological drives. They've simply put them on algorithmic steroids, creating a hyper-efficient sorting mechanism.
Riker breaks down the math of this sorting mechanism, exploring what he calls Tinder economics.
Oh man, the Tinder economics data.
The data he presents is absolutely brutal for the average man. He notes that on major dating platforms, women swipe right, indicating interest, on only roughly 4.5% to 10% of the male profiles they see.
Just a tiny fraction.
Furthermore, women rate 80% of all men on these platforms as quote-unquote below average in attractiveness.
The statistical absurdity of that is profound. I mean, it's mathematically impossible for 80% of a normally distributed population to be below average.
Right.
But that mathematical impossibility highlights the extreme selectivity and the skewed perception Riker is pointing to. This is the Pareto principle applied to human reproduction.
He actually tracks an informal social experiment in the book where a completely average, decent-looking man with a solid, middle-class job creates a profile and gets 0 matches over a month.
0 matches.
Then, a profile is created using pictures of a champion powerlifter with markers of high status, and that profile receives 500 matches in 2 weeks, despite the bio being intentionally arrogant or dismissive.
Riker's argument here is that modern women demand the traditional benefits of male provisioning. They want the resources, the physical protection, the high status, the lifestyle, but they absolutely reject any of the traditional female roles or compromises that historically accompanied that arrangement.
He views this as a completely rigged game, a casino where the average man is essentially locked out of the mating market entirely, while a tiny fraction of top-tier men monopolize the attention.
And the tragedy, according to Riker, is what happens when those rigged games occasionally result in marriages, and those marriages inevitably fail under the weight of these unrealistic expectations.
Because when a marriage dissolves, we enter the realm of the legal system.
Right. And Riker fundamentally redefines the institution of marriage with the acronym SCAM.
SCAM. State-controlled asset matrimony.
He views the family court system not as a mediator of disputes, but as a quote-unquote feminist plunder engine.
And those are his exact unfiltered words.
And he backs up this explosive claim with a barrage of statistical data. He points out that women initiate between 70% and 80% of all divorces in the United States.
Yet, despite being the ones to initiate the termination of the contract, men are ordered to pay roughly 97% of all alimony.
Furthermore, mothers win primary custody in up to 90% of contested custody battles.
Riker paints a picture of a legal structure that actively incentivizes women to break up their families because the state essentially guarantees them massive cash prizes, lifetime subsidies, and total control of the children if they simply decide they are unhappy.
And he breaks down the mechanism of how this control is achieved, focusing heavily on the concept of maternal gatekeeping. He argues that family courts routinely rubber stamp claims of quote-unquote maternal instinct, or prioritize the mother's bond, even when there is documented evidence of the mother's unfitness, substance abuse, or severe psychological instability.
He shares harrowing anecdotes of men who work 80-hour work weeks specifically to provide a high standard of living for their families.
But when the divorce happens, that exact dedication is weaponized against them.
Right. A judge deems the man an absentee father because he was working, while the mother who initiated the divorce gets to keep the house, the primary custody, and the child support derived from his labor.
But the absolute most chilling concept he brings up in this analysis of the family courts is the phenomenon of paternity fraud.
This is where the biological and the legal crash into each other violently.
Yeah. Riker cites epidemiological estimates suggesting that roughly 1% to 3% of all men in Western societies are currently raising children that are not biologically theirs without knowing it.
And he details a specific, horrifying legal case of a man from Detroit. This man paid over $250,000 in court-ordered child support over 18 years.
250 grand.
He eventually obtained a DNA test that definitively proved the child was not biologically his. His ex-wife had lied the entire time.
And what was the family court's response to this proven multi-decade fraud? The judge still forced him to pay the arrears and continue support, claiming it was in the best interest of the child to maintain the financial status quo, regardless of the deception.
Riker categorizes this as state-sanctioned theft and legally mandated cuckoldry.
This specific legal reality leads to a crucial evolutionary extrapolation for Riker. He argues that evolutionary biology specifically designed men to unconsciously monitor paternity cues.
From a Darwinian perspective, investing massive time, energy, and resources into another man's genetic offspring is the ultimate evolutionary dead end. It is biological failure.
Exactly. And by legally enforcing this outcome, by using the power of the state to force men to fund their own genetic replacement, Riker claims society is committing the ultimate act of psychological violence against the male biological imperative.
So if the legal system, the corporate system, and the romantic mating market are all as heavily skewed and structurally hostile as Riker claims, it forces a chronological question.
Where are people learning these behaviors?
Right. Where is the blueprint for this behavior being written before it enters the adult world? Riker points his finger directly at the foundation of modern society, the education system.
This takes us to his investigation of the modern university.
And Riker launches a full-scale, unmitigated attack on modern academia. He argues that universities no longer function as places of higher learning or objective inquiry. He categorizes vast swaths of academia simply as grievance studies departments.
To support this, he points to enrollment and funding data showing that these grievance-focused programs, gender studies, critical race theory, sociology, have expanded their administrative bloat and faculty numbers 240% faster than hard STEM fields like physics, engineering, or mathematics since the year 2000.
240% faster. He argues these institutions are literal assembly lines, and their primary economic product is professional victims.
They manufacture students who view the world entirely through the lens of oppression dynamics.
But far worse than that, he claims these institutions exist to systematically indoctrinate young boys and men to actively hate their own natural masculinity.
He meticulously breaks down the mechanics of how this indoctrination is enforced, starting with the disciplinary systems. He looks heavily at Title IX tribunals on college campuses, which he openly describes as kangaroo courts.
He traces the history of this back to the Obama-era Dear Colleague letter, which fundamentally changed how universities handled accusations of sexual misconduct.
Right? It forced universities to adopt the preponderance of evidence standard.
Which fundamentally means a 50.1% chance of guilt. It is a coin flip, as opposed to the criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt.
And if you combine that extremely low evidentiary threshold With the pervasive cultural dogma of believe all women, Riker argues that the fundamental Western legal concept of due process has been completely obliterated on college campuses.
He lists terrifying, well-documented examples to illustrate the mechanics of these tribunals. He details cases of young men being permanently expelled, their academic futures and reputations destroyed over completely fabricated claims.
He discusses cases where simple mourning after regret from a consensual hookup is retroactively categorized as assault, with zero hard evidence or police involvement required by the university panel.
He references the infamous Duke lacrosse case, breaking down how the media and the university administration colluded to destroy the lives of student athletes based on a false accusation, simply because the narrative fit their ideological preconceptions of toxic masculinity and privilege.
Riker also dissects the specific psychological frameworks being taught. He spends a lot of time analyzing the Duluth model of domestic violence.
For context, the Duluth model was created in the 1980s and is based on a power and control wheel. It is taught in these grievance studies departments and heavily utilized by police departments globally.
The core mechanic of the Duluth model is that it inherently, structurally assumes men are always the primary aggressors in any domestic dispute, framing violence as a tool of patriarchal control.
But Riker points out that this entirely ignores robust CDC data showing that women actually initiate roughly 70% of all non-reciprocal domestic violence.
The educational model simply ignores the data to maintain the ideology.
And moving from the legalistic to the psychological, Riker examines the behavioral conditioning occurring inside the classrooms themselves. He describes the use of exercises like privilege walks.
Oh man, privilege walks.
Yeah. In these exercises, young male students are forced to physically stand in a line and take steps backward, moving to the back of the room based on their gender, race, or sexual orientation, in order to physically visualize their supposed structural privilege and their inherent role as oppressors.
Riker does not see this as a sociology lesson. He categorizes it as a public humiliation ritual, a psychological braking mechanism designed specifically to induce guilt and shatter male confidence at a key developmental stage.
Reading his description of the modern university, it feels like Riker views these campuses as ideological boot camps.
Yeah.
Like, you, as a parent, are essentially paying $60,000 a year in tuition for your son to be sequestered in an environment that teaches him that his very existence is an inherent oppression to others, and that his biological drives are inherently toxic.
And Riker juxtaposes this internal cultural sabotage with massive global realities. He points out that while we are busy forcing male engineering students to attend privilege walks, geopolitical rivals like China are graduating 9 highly competent STEM majors for every one of ours.
It is a stark existential contrast between a culture obsessed with ideological conditioning and a culture focused on brutal, practical competence and technological dominance.
But I want to explore causality here for a second.
Why?
Riker brings up the undeniable macro-level data about the crisis of boys in education. Boys are falling significantly behind girls in writing and math. They're dropping out of high school at much higher rates. They're being diagnosed with behavioral disorders at record levels. And they make up a rapidly shrinking minority percentage of college enrollments.
Right.
Does Riker view this massive systemic failure of boys as a deliberate, orchestrated conspiracy of this feminist education system? Or does he see it as an accidental, emergent byproduct of simply removing competition and catering to female learning styles?
Oh, Riker is unequivocal on this point. He does not view it as an accident. He views it as a deliberate structural feature of the system. He argues that the modern educational system was explicitly redesigned to suppress male energy because natural male traits, competitiveness, aggression, physical restlessness, a desire to challenge authority, threaten the collective, compliant, egalitarian ethos that the institutions want to foster.
So when young boys display natural, energetic, boisterous behaviors, the system doesn't channel that energy. It immediately pathologizes it.
Exactly. It medicates boys with powerful stimulants for ADHD to force them to sit still in highly structured, passive learning environments.
The system has replaced objective, competitive grading, where there are clear winners and losers, with collaborative equity circles and participation grades.
By doing this, Riker claims the system is actively, chemically, and psychologically neutralizing the future male leaders, innovators, and risk takers.
Which brings us to the absolute climax of the book.
Let's get to it.
If we accept Riker's premise, if the corporate workplace is an autoimmune disease of HR complaints, if the family courts are a plunder engine designed to strip men of their assets, If the dating market is mathematically rigged against 80% of men, and if the schools are actively medicating away male energy, what is a man actually supposed to do?
How does he survive?
Exactly. This takes us to his final framework, the masculinity counterattack and rebuilding reality.
This section is where Riker transitions from cultural autopsy to delivering direct, actionable solutions, highly tailored for his MRA and manosphere audience.
And his primary directive is not political activism, it is total rejection.
He fiercely advocates for men to completely reject the victim narrative that the culture offers them and to initiate a strategic, calculated withdrawal from what he sees as irreversibly rigged systems.
This tactical withdrawal aligns very closely with the core philosophy of MGTOW men going their own way.
Riker lays out a highly specific doctrine he calls the personal power protocols, and the very first step of this protocol. He tells men to completely stop negotiating with what he terms harpies.
Harpies individuals who utilize emotional manipulation, perpetual victimhood, and spiritual bypassing to extract resources or compliance.
He advises men to ruthlessly cut these people out of their personal and professional lives. Financially, he advocates for absolute segregation. He tells men to completely separate their finances.
And if a man makes the highly risky choice to enter the legal contract of marriage, Riker insists on ironclad prenuptial agreements that must include explicit, financially ruinous infidelity clauses.
Because he trusts the biology of hypergamy more than the romance of wedding vows.
He also recommends a posture of highly defensive living. He suggests men use what he calls consequence journals.
The mechanics of this are intense. He advises men to meticulously document every interaction, keep every receipt, save screenshots of texts, and utilize hidden audio recordings if legally permissible in their state, in all of their romantic relationships.
Why? To protect themselves legally against the omnipresent threat of false accusations of abuse, Title IX complaints, or financial mismanagement during a set or divorce.
It is a deeply adversarial, highly paranoid view of human cohabitation.
It is incredibly adversarial. It frames every relationship as potential Cold War.
Right.
But his protocols are not just about defense and withdrawal. He also focuses heavily on building.
Right. He calls for men to actively construct and protect exclusive male-only spaces. He specifically highlights environments like Brazilian jiu-jitsu gyms, powerlifting clubs, or backcountry hunting groups.
He views these not just as hobbies, but as vital proxies for ancient male coalition building.
These are places where men can engage in raw, physical, biological competition. They can experience hierarchical dominance and submission based on pure merit, and they can rely on intense male bonding for genuine accountability.
Riker argues this raw, physical accountability is the only antidote to the neuroses of the modern world. And he explicitly warns men against relying on female-led talk therapy, which he believes will simply pathologize their masculine drives and strip them of their agency.
His ultimate advice to his reader is essentially a modern restatement of extreme stoic excellence. He tells his audience to focus entirely on their own competence and become undeniable.
His final mandate is, lift heavy weights, stack your cash, ruthlessly guard your personal freedom, and focus your energy on building things that feminists cannot fundamentally tear down or regulate away.
It is a raw call to radical self-reliance. If we zoom out and synthesize Riker's entire sprawling worldview, it fundamentally boils down to this singular premise. Civilization at its core requires male sacrifice, male risk-taking, and unapologetic male leadership to function and survive in a hostile universe.
And by culturally and legally pathologizing the very mechanics of masculinity, society is committing cultural seppuku. We're cutting our own throat while complaining about the mess.
Riker's ultimate strategy isn't to hold protest signs, vote for specific politicians, or beg these feminist institutions to change their rules. His call is far more subversive.
He is telling men to simply walk away. Let the bloated corporate HR departments, the grievance-obsessed universities, and the heavily biased legal systems eventually collapse under the crushing weight of their own affirmative incompetence and massive structural inefficiencies.
While that collapse happens, he wants men to focus all their productive energy on building their own parallel, merit-based, technologically superior structures in the shadows.
We have covered an immense, challenging amount of ground today.
We really have. We've navigated through some of the most incredibly turbulent, controversial, and intellectually aggressive waters in modern cultural discourse, tracing a line from ancient bone density to modern family court data.
And as we wrap up this massive analysis, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. This is a question inspired by the deep mechanics of Riker's text, but looking outward at the broader macroeconomic reality of our species.
If Riker is fundamentally correct in his core assertion, if global civilization relies entirely on the invisible, unappreciated foundation of male risk-taking, male physical labor, and the biological male drive to build and conquer just to keep the lights on and the water running, what exactly happens to the global economy when an entire generation of capable men successfully goes their own way and simply refuses to participate in the very institutions that desperately need their blood, sweat, and labor to survive?
That is a deeply chilling, systemic question to mull over.
If the ancient hardware collectively decides to unplug itself from the matrix, what happens to the software? Does the screen just go dark?
It's definitely something to think about.
We want to thank you for joining us on this massive, intense deep dive. Please, right now, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the show. Your support is exactly what allows us to keep bringing you these deep, unvarnished explorations of the world's most provocative and challenging source materials.
We truly appreciate your time, your attention to detail, and your critical thinking as we unpack these complex frameworks.
And as a final reminder, if you want to examine Conrad Riker's full, uncensored arguments, verify his data, and read his specific strategies for yourself, check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks right now to buy the ebook, Victim Bombing Harpies, Spiritual Bypassing to Avoid.
And make sure you follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack so you don't miss his latest writings and cultural commentary.
Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.